Hi everyone, today's topic is SAT reading and writing. The domain is information ideas and the skill is inference. Difficulty level is easy. Let's start. Microbes that live in shallow lakes and ponds produce methane, a harmful greenhouse gas. Ecologist Ralph Aben and his team wanted to see how different types of shallow water plants might affect the amount of methane that escapes into the atmosphere. Aben's team set up some water tanks with soil and microbes from local ponds. Some tanks had a type of underwater plant that grows in the soil called water foil. Other tanks had either duckweed or type of plant that floats on the water surface or algae. Aben and his team wanted to find that tanks with duckweed and algae released higher levels of methane than tanks with water and foil did. So, duckweed and algae released more methane, but water and foil released less methane. This finding suggests that the presence of some kinds of underwater plants like water and foil helps prevent methane from escaping shallow lakes and ponds. The answer is probably A because exactly this plant released way less methane, but plants that are on the surface of the lake of the pond, like duckweed and algae, release way more methane, so water and foil is way better. Let's look at other choices too to eliminate them. Shallow lakes and ponds release more methane than deeper bodies of water. Actually, we don't really know how deep the pond is, so we cannot make any kind of conclusions about this. That's why we need to eliminate shallow lakes and deeper lakes. Shallow lakes and ponds are more likely to contain algae, to contain either water and foil or duckweed. Again, we don't know how deep the lake is or pond. That's why C is wrong. Having a mix of algae, underwater plants and floating plants is the best way to reduce the amount of methane in shallow lakes and ponds. The best is having only water and foil because it's the most helpful. Duckweed and algae do not really help a lot in order to control the release of methane, so the answer D is also wrong. It needed to contain only water and foil, which we can see here actually. So the answer is A. In their book Smart Pricing, Jagmohan Raju and John Zhang consider musicians' use of non-traditional pay-as-you-wish pricing model. This model generally offers listeners the choice to pay more or less than a suggested price for a song or album, or even to pay nothing at all. Other authors note that the option most listeners chose for an album by the band Harvey Danger. Only about 1% opted to pay for the album, resulting in the earnings below the band's expectations. But the authors also discuss musician Jane Seabury, who saw significant earnings from her pay-as-you-wish online music store. As a result, many listeners choosing to pay more than the store's suggested price. Hence, the pay-as-you-wish model may prove financially successful for some musicians but disappointing for others. The answer is probably A. Hold greater financial appeal for bands than for individual musicians. Not really. Here we see that the band didn't earn enough money. It was way below their expectations, but for Jane Seabury, it was way above her expectations. So answer B is wrong, because most musicians who use the model to lower the suggested prices of their songs and albums over time. Not really. It doesn't say that it caused them to lower the prices. It just told us the results of pay-as-you-wish for two people, for one band and one musician. More strongly reflect differences in certain musicians' popularity than traditional pricing models do. It doesn't say that it reflects the difference between people in popularity. That's why answer D is also wrong. The answer is A. proved financially successful for some musicians and disappointing for others. It was successful for Jane Seabury, but disappointing for the Harvey Danger. Arthur Conan Doyle's stories about Detective Sherlock Holmes were published between 1887 and 1927. They have inspired countless successful adaptations, including comic strips, movies, and a television series, Sherlock Holmes, directed by Hayao Miyazaki, who is celebrated for his animated movies. Until 2014, these stories were copyrighted. The right to adapt was only available to those who could afford the copyright fee and gain approval from the strict copyright holders of Doyle's estate. Some journalists predict that the number of Sherlock Holmes adaptations is likely to increase, since the end of the copyright means that Doyle's original stories will become hard to find. On the contrary, it will be easier for people to gain it because it will be free and you will not need an approval as you did before 2014. People will become more interested in detective stories than they were in the 1800s. It doesn't talk about people's interest in detective stories. The main point here is the fact that after 2014, people will get the copyright way easier. It will be easier to get the copyright than before. Let's look at C. Producing adaptations will become easier and less expensive. Probably the answer is C. And let's eliminate D2. The former copyright holders of Doyle's estate will return fees they collected. And no one will return fees. The main idea here is C. The answer is C. Okay, let's move on. One aspect of in-person shopping that online shopping can replicate is the opportunity to touch a product before buying it. Does this difference matter? In an experiment, researchers asked one group of participants to touch a mug, a toy, while another group was prohibited from touching the two items. The participants were then asked how much money they'd pay for the items. People who got to touch the items were willing to pay much more money for them than people who weren't allowed to touch the items. This finding suggests that people who mainly shop online probably spend more money every month than people who mainly shop in person. No, it tells that people who touched it were willing to pay way more money, but people who shop online do not really want to pay more. In-person shopping may make products seem more valuable than they seem if only viewed online. The answer is probably B. Because while shopping in person, people want to pay more, but online, when they cannot touch, they don't want to pay as much. Retailers with in-person and online stores should charge the same price for a given product in both places. This one is also wrong because the main idea is how people perceive the product and not how retailers price their products. Online retailers may be able to raise the prices they charge for products that are only available online. The same reason as C. So the answer is B. Archaeologists have been debating the origin of a rare form of lead found in Shang Dynasty bronze artifacts since its presence was discovered in China in 1990s. Different researchers have proposed theories on which regions of the world would have had the raw materials containing the specific lead in these artifacts, but no conclusive evidence has been presented. What is intriguing is that bronze artifacts from China dated after the Shang Dynasty do not contain this form of lead, suggesting that Shang Dynasty bronze pieces are rare and therefore more valuable than those from other time periods. I think the main idea, the conclusion here should be about the fact that people already spent all the lead in Shang Dynasty, so for other periods of time there was none left. The source of some of the raw materials used to make bronze was exploited only until the end of the Shang Dynasty. Bronze was used for a short time during the Shang Dynasty before different metals were used to make artifacts. Answer C is wrong. It's not about its popularity, they couldn't use that bronze still. but they probably stopped doing that because there was none left. Methods used to analyze bronze artifacts aren't useful on pieces that are dated after the Shang dynasty again. This one is also wrong. The answer is probably B. The source of the raw materials used to make bronze was exploited only until the end of Shang dynasty. Because this already mentions that it was used and during the Shang dynasty all the bronze was gone, so they couldn't use it. The answer A is wrong because Shang dynasty bronze pieces are rare and therefore more valuable. It is valuable, but it doesn't explain why lead isn't used anymore. It was only used during Shang dynasty, so the answer is B. Off-Broadway theaters emerged in the 1950s as a rebellion against mainstream Broadway theaters in New York, freeing artists to create productions that were more experimental than typical Broadway shows. One such artist was playwright Medea Irene Fornes. Working with off-Broadway theaters enabled Fornes not only to direct her own. Alright, let's move to the next question. Here what we have, off-Broadway theaters emerged in the late 1950s as a rebellion against mainstream Broadway theaters in New York, freeing artists to create productions that were more experimental than typical Broadway shows. One such artist was playwright Medea Irene Fornes. Working with off-Broadway theaters enabled Fornes not only to direct her own plays, but also direct them exactly as she intended them to be staged, regardless of how strange the results might have seemed to audiences accustomed to Broadway shows. In this way, Fornes wrote plays that would have been too expensive to produce if someone else had directed the production. It doesn't really talk about the cost of something, so expensive isn't really suitable here. Recognize that staging an off-Broadway play was more complicated than staging a Broadway play. Again, it doesn't talk about the complexity. It just tells that Broadway shows is way more different than off-Broadway shows. Would have been more famous if she had created plays of that for mainstream instead of experimental? No. Illustrates that the artistic opportunity offered by off-Broadway theaters. Yes, because off-Broadway theaters weren't regular, so here people could illustrate their artistical abilities. So here answer is D. North American gray wolves usually have mixed gray and white fur, but some members of the species have a version of a gene or gene variant that gives them a mostly black coat instead. Sarah Cabanes and her team studied 12 populations of North American gray wolves. They found that the black-furred wolves are more common in areas where outbreaks of distemper virus happen regularly. So black-furred wolves are more common in areas where outbreaks distemper virus. Okay, let's highlight this part. And the team also discovered that the black-furred wolves are more likely to be immune to distemper than gray-wolved wolves are. Taken together, these findings suggest that North American gray wolves experience more outbreaks of distemper virus than other wolves do. On the contrary, black-furred wolves probably had more outbreaks before, so right now they are immune to that. The gene variant that results in black fur may be linked to immunity to distemper virus. The answer is probably probably B. The average lifespan of gray wolves is likely to increase over time because of a particular gene variant. It doesn't talk about lifespan, it just tells that black-furred wolves are immune to distemper virus, however, gray wolves aren't immune to that. Gray-furred wolves will soon replace black-furred wolves across North America. Again, it doesn't really talk about that, and that's why the answer is B. In the 1950s and 60s, plant breeders created shorter varieties of feet and rice plants with improved yields. Kelly Gillespie, Rex Bernardo, and other plant specialists are building on that work by exploring the development of shorter corn varieties. Greater height can allow individual plants to produce more ears of corn. However, greater height also makes the stalks more likely to snap or be uprooted in strong winds before the corn can be harvested. Because of this trade-off, some plant specialists suggest that shorter corn varieties will actually help improve yields of harvested corn by being more likely to survive in severe winds. The answer is probably A, because in the text it was mentioned that height affects the corn that can survive, so if they're quite long, in this case it will be difficult for them to survive, so the harvest will be less. But if they are short, they will survive the wind, and in this case the yield will be way more. Let's eliminate other choices. B, more likely to be uprooted due to weight of the corn on stalks. No, this one is wrong because high corns, long corns will be hard to survive. They will probably not survive. Require more land for plantings than short varieties of wheat and rice typically do. It doesn't talk about the land that corn covers, only the height of it and how easy it will be to harvest them. Not easy to harvest them, just how much corn will survive. Begin developing more ears of corn on each plant than the tallest variety of corn currently does. Usually tall corns have more ears, and that's why this one is also wrong. The answer is A. Archaeologist Christina Kohler and her team excavated the Egyptian tomb of Queen Mernes, the wife of a first dynasty pharaoh. Some scholars claim that she also ruled Egypt on her own and was actually the first female pharaoh. The team found a tablet in Mernes' tomb with writing suggesting that she was in charge of the country's treasury and other central offices. Whether Mernes was a pharaoh or not, this discovery supports the idea that Mernes likely had an important role in Egypt's government. The answer probably is this one, because the text mentions that she was in charge of the treasury and also central offices, which is quite important. That's why the answer is probably A, but let's look at other choices too. She lived after rather than before First Dynasty of Egypt. In the previous sentence, I mentioned of her importance, and that's why we need to continue this topic. That's why the B isn't really correct. Traveled beyond Egypt's borders often. It doesn't. The text didn't mention about how much she traveled or gave any clue about it. So the answer isn't C. Created a new form of writing. It wasn't mentioned in the text. It just tells that there was a tablet and it suggested that she was quite important. That's why the answer is A. The national tree is a rare variety of cacao. Nationals were thought to have gone extinct by the 20th century due to a fungus. This fungus can spread from tree to nearby trees through the air and cause diseases. By around 2013, cacao expert Silvio Pechard located some of these national trees. The trees were in the Piedra de Plata coastal forest within a hard-to-reach valley in Ecuador. Conservationists informed that national trees in Piedra de Plata might have avoided the diseases that wiped out other trees because early 20th century scientists didn't know why so many nationals were becoming infected. It wouldn't help them to survive the disease. The ability of the fungus to travel through air was only recently discovered. Even if it was recently discovered, before the discovery, they still could travel through air and infect other trees. So answer B is also wrong. They were too far from the other national trees infected by the fungus to become infected themselves. The answer is probably C, because it explains the reason why they weren't infected and still prosper. The chocolate made from their pods was highly valued. It wouldn't affect the fungus. That's why the answer isn't D. The only possible answer is C. It explains why they are still those trees are still in Piedra de Plata, and that's why the answer is C. Sensible explanation. It gives us a sensible explanation. Let's move on to the next question. In many cultures, a handshake can create trust between people. Engineer Avelino and his team are designing a robot to shake hands with a human in order to improve human-robot interactions. The robot hand adjusts its movements and pressure to better imitate the feel of a human hand. The researchers want the robot's handshake to feel realistic because lifelike handshakes may make people more comfortable interacting with robots. The answer is probably A, because the text also mentions that they created this robot because handshakes will improve human-robot interactions. In humans, in cultures, handshake can create trust between people. Therefore, in order to create trust between humans and robots, engineers created this robot. So people can trust the robots. It's easier to program a robot to perform handshake than it is to program a robot to perform some other types of greetings. It doesn't talk about other kinds of greetings at all, so the answer isn't B. People are less likely to interact with robots that don't like humans. They didn't make it human-like. Instead, people made that robot to imitate the handshake, not how humans look. The robot in the researchers' study may have uses other than interacting with humans. No, it was designed in order to imitate handshakes, so the answer is A. Martin, Vivian, and colleagues have identified a new carnivorous plant species in Indonesia. Like other carnivorous plants, Enpudica has pitfall traps or pitchers that capture prey, but unlike others, the pitchers of Enpudica are located underground. The researchers unearthed the new species on fairly dry ridges with surfaces that host few other plants and animals. Therefore, the researchers hypothesized that the Enpudica species is likely. So, it was located in dry species where few other plants and animals are on Earth, and due to this reason, probably Enpudica evolutionized the way so it could capture animals underground in order to survive. We need to find this kind of answer now here. Represents one of many undiscovered carnivorous plant species in the region. No, it's not the answer. From pitchers early in development to absorb more moisture. Is buried by nearby animals as they forage along the ridges for food? No. Evolved to have underground traps to access more prey than would surface on traps. The answer is probably D, because it explains why it has pitchers underground instead of above the ground. Also, text mentions that above the ground there are little animals and plants. So it would be underground pitchers helped this plant survive. The answer is D. In the South Pacific, New Caledonian crows use two different kinds of stick tools. One tool is complex. The crows shape a stick from a rare plant into a hook. The other tool is basic. The crows find a stick without a hook on the ground. The hooked tool is harder to get, but it is much better than the basic tool at removing prey from holes. When studying New Caledonian crows, ecologist Barbara Klump found that they hold the hooked tools in their claws when not using them, or they carefully put them in a safe place. The crows don't do the same with basic tools. This suggests to Klump that the hooked stick tools are more valuable to the crows than the stick tools without hooks. Okay, let's look at the choices. But the answer probably should be about the fact that hooked tools are more valuable because it takes more time and effort to make, but tools without hook are easy to make, and that's why they're less valuable. Hooked stick tools are more valuable to the crows than the stick tools without hooks. The answer is probably A. Hooked stick tools are easier for most of the crows to hold. It doesn't tells that it's easier for crows to hold them. Crows prefer to share their hook to stick tools, but don't share stick tools without hooks. No, they do not share it. They usually just put there somewhere carefully, or they just hold there in their claws. So the answer is in C. Crows realize that both kinds of stick tools are less effective than their claws. No, they actually consider the hook tools quite valuable. So the answer is A. Georgia Douglas Johnson wrote many plays in the 1920s and 1930s. At the time, professional theater companies rarely put on plays by black women, so few of Johnson's plays made it to the stage. Only a small number of her plays were published in her lifetime, but that doesn't mean that Johnson never learned what other people thought of her plays. Johnson hosted weekly get-togethers for fellow black writers and artists in her Washington, D.C. home. Attendees would read and discuss one another's work, including Johnson's own. These gatherings could therefore serve as an occasion for professional theater companies to put on plays. No, they just use those gatherings in order to talk about each other's works and evaluate them. An opportunity for Johnson to get feedback on her plays. Exactly, the answer is probably B, because when she showed her plays, it would be easier for her to get feedback, because she couldn't put on stage the majority of her works because she was a black woman. A way for Johnson to learn about plays that were produced in other cities. It doesn't talk about other cities. That's why the answer isn't C. A subject matter for future plays by Johnson. No, they just show each other's work, so mostly they use it for evaluation. So the answer is B. If an animal has been extinct for a long time, how can scientists learn what color it was? One group of scientists came up with a possible answer. When the scientists examined the fossilized feather of an extinct bird, they found melanosomes in it. Melanosomes produce pigment or grains of color inside cells. Because melanosomes are shaped differently depending on which colors they produce, the scientists hypothesized that they could show how melanosomes can be found in fossils belonging to animals from other extinct species. The answer is probably not A, because the main idea here is the fact that thanks to melanosomes, they can find out what colors the extinct animals were. Determine the colors of bird based on the appearance of the melanosomes in the feather. The answer is probably B, because it just explains what I just told before that. The answer is C. Explain why the melanosomes in the feather were so well preserved. No, it doesn't really talk about the fact that they were quite well preserved. The answer D is the option D, actually. Identify the colors of extinct animals whose fossils lack melanosomes. If the feather lacks melanosomes, then it would be impossible for scientists to determine what color the animal was. That's why the answer is probably B. Alice Guy Blanche directed hundreds of films between 1896 and 1920. She wanted audiences to feel like they were watching real people on screen. She would encourage actors in her films to behave naturally. Guy Blanche even hung a large sign reading "Be Natural" in the studio where she made her films. At the time, films lacked sound, so actors needed to rely solely on their bodies and facial expressions to convey emotions. As a result, actors tended to highly exaggerate their actions and expressions. The style of acting in Guy Blanche's films was therefore so it wasn't usual for that period. The answer is probably C, because usually during that period people exaggerated their emotions on films, but Guy Blanche's films was on contrary quite different. They didn't exaggerate, so they were quite natural, unlike two other actors. Let's eliminate other choices. Copied by many of Guy Blanche's peers, it doesn't talk about other Directors, so the answer isn't A. Familiar, so actors who had worked on other directors' film. It wasn't familiar because it wasn't ordinary for that period of time. People usually exaggerated their emotions instead, better than film acting today. It doesn't talk about today's films at all, so D is also wrong. The answer is C. To create the poems in her 2017 collection, One Last Word, poet Nikki Grimes used a writing method called the Golden Shovel. This method often involves choosing a line from an existing poem and then using each word from that line as the last word of each line in a new poem. Grimes wanted the poem in One Last Word to honor important Black poets of the past, so she chose lines by poets such as Langston Hughes, Georgia Douglas Johnson. Writing in this way can be challenging and might seem as though it would produce awkward poems. However, reviewers praised One Last Word as a beautiful and powerful tribute to the poets who inspired it. This reaction suggests that most reviewers didn't understand Grimes' goal for One Last Word. On the contrary, they thought that it was a powerful tribute to the poets who inspired it. That's why the answer isn't A. Grimes successfully used the Golden Shovel method to achieve her goal for One Last Word. The answer is probably B, because people liked it and she also achieved her goal and wrote a beautiful poem which also included important Black poets. Let's look at C. Langston Hughes and Georgia Douglas Johnson are two of Grimes' favorite poets. It doesn't talk about her favorite poets. Grimes inspired many other writers to create poems using the Golden Shovel method. She didn't inspire other poets to use it, so the answer isn't D, so the only possible choice is B. Researchers wanted to study how consumers' reaction to an ad may be affected by other ads. The researchers began by showing study participants an ad for a product, with some seeing a less detailed ad and others seeing a more detailed one. Then all participants viewed the same second ad for a store and shared their opinion of the store based on this second ad. Participants who had first seen an ad less detailed than the second ad had a higher opinion of the store than the participants who had first seen a more detailed ad. So seeing more detailed ad means that people will have a lesser opinion about the store. But if you see a less detailed ad first, then you will have higher opinion about that store. Researchers concluded that reactions to an ad may be affected by the number of people who viewed the ad. No. The length of time viewing previous ads. Again, the most important thing here is detail. The amount of detail viewed in previous ads. The answer is probably C. It mentions details just like here. The time of day that the ad viewed. It doesn't talk about the time of day that the ad was viewed by participants. And so the answer is C. The musical Hadestown Down was produced off-Broadway in New York in 2016. A revised version of the musical premiered on Broadway in 2019 in a larger production. In a review of the Broadway production, theater critic Jesse Green enthusiastically praised the musical storytelling. However, Green also explains that he had seen the earlier version of Hadestown in 2016 and found the storytelling to be very confusing. This suggests that, in Green's views, the 2016 version of Hadestown had fewer storytelling problems than the 2019 version did. On the contrary, 2016 was more confusing. Hadestown should have had a larger production in 2019 than it actually did. Critics actually liked the 2019 version. That's why the answer isn't B. The 2019 version of Hadestown was less enjoyable. On the contrary, it was more enjoyable. It was praised, but the 2016 version was confusing. Hadestown improved greatly between 2016 and its premiere on Broadway. Exactly, the answer is D, because critics didn't like the 2016 version, but they praised the 2019 version. A main goal of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, an arts organization founded in 1965, is to advance new works by Black musicians. The AACM achieves this goal in part by focusing on young artists, by having established musicians and composers serve as mentors. The AACM gives young artists the benefits of expert technical training and creative guidance. Numerous organizations offer similar kinds of support to new generations of painters, writers, and other artists, suggesting that artists of all ages benefit more from technical training than from creative guidance. It just talks about AACM, not generally about artists. Many art organizations recognize the importance of providing opportunities for young artists to learn from experienced mentors. The answer actually can be B because numerous organizations use it. That's why I think the answer is B, but let's look to other choices too. Most established artists could become even better artists by serving as mentors. No. It just tells us organizations support new generations of artists, writers, actors, and it doesn't say that they need to be mentors in order to be more established artists. So the answer is in C. Finding a mentor is more important for musicians than it is for painters. Again, it doesn't talk about the fact that who needs more mentors. That's why the answer is probably D. And it's all for today. Thank you for watching, and bye.